Welcome to the Word of God. You know, we are so wedded to reading history books, to reading the daily newspaper, to watching the news on the TV. We want to know the facts. We want to know what the Prime Minister said yesterday, what the Prime Minister did yesterday. We want to know exactly what happened. And when we open the Bible too, very often that's our mentality as well. We want to know what happened. As if the Bible is like our newspaper, or the Bible is like a history book telling us exactly what happened on a particular day. And so we ask questions. Did it really happen? Did God create the world in 6 days? Did God have a garden in which he put the man he had formed out of clay? We ask, did Moses actually see God? Did the waters of the Red Sea stand up like a wall? And so on. But actually these are all irrelevant questions, because the Bible authors are not interested in telling us precisely what happened. Their interest lies elsewhere. Their aim is not to give us the facts of history, even if they knew them. And very often they didn't know them. Who knows how the world was created? The Bible tells us how the Israelite people understood God and understood themselves, and how God had worked in their historical circumstances. So they saw God's hand at work in all the vicissitudes of their history. No doubt there were traditions, many of them oral traditions, handed on from generation to generation, about the origins of their race, about their father called Abraham, and the stories about him, and his son Isaac, and Isaac's son Jacob, and Jacob's life and sons. There were traditions handed on by ballad singers and storytellers, and other stories of how their forefathers were in Egypt, and the story about Joseph, who became the, as it were, prime minister of Egypt, and how they became eventually slaves in Egypt, but they escaped and came to the land of Canaan. And there were traditions and stories about all these. And there may have been also written records too, to some extent. We don't know, because we don't have them. We don't have any written records of the time, so we may presume that there were, but we don't know. So the Israelites saw themselves, first of all, as the chosen people of God. That is how they saw themselves. And they were going to express this in a story form. Let us remember too that unlike modern people today, the ancient people, when they expressed the truths that they believed in, they expressed them in the form of stories, not in the form of theoretical lectures. So they would tell a story to illustrate and convey the truth which they believed in. And so we have stories about how God chose them. But the truth is that they were conveying is that we are the chosen people, chosen by God. And that is true. We can read this, for instance, in one of the letters of St. Paul, the letter to the Romans. Paul was a Jew, and he was a Pharisee, and he was very proud of his race and of his tribe, which was the tribe of Benjamin. So, talking about the Israelites, he says, they are the people of Israel, chosen to be God's adopted children. So, the Jews are the people of Israel, chosen to be God's adopted children. And he says, God revealed his glory to them. He made covenants with them and gave them his law. He gave them the privilege of worshiping him and receiving his wonderful promises. So, in a word, that is how the Jews saw themselves. They saw themselves as the chosen people, God's people. From the time of David, who reigned 1,000 years before Christ, we have the monarchy, the dynasty of David. Sons of David ruled in Jerusalem, but as we have seen in a previous talk, the 10 tribes of the north, they rebelled against the south, against the king of Jerusalem, and formed their own kingdom in Samaria. They were also the sons of Abraham, but they had a different political kingdom, and they ruled from Samaria. The Bible is mainly written in Jerusalem, and so Jerusalem takes the major part of the Bible. And the biblical authors are interested in the kings, not in the way they organize the country, and not in their political dealings so much as to whether they were leading the people according to the covenant made at Sinai. At Sinai, under Moses, God made a covenant with the Israelites, and he gave them the law, and he gave them the laws. In the Bible there are 613 laws, and the kings of Israel were to lead the people in the way of Yahweh, so according to the laws laid down in the covenant. And if they did that, then the prophets praised the kings. If they didn't do that, then the prophets condemned them. Now the kings themselves, they were ruling a very small nation surrounded by aggressive, mighty empires. Egypt, Assyria, and Syria, Babylon, and Persia. These mighty empires surrounded this small country of Israel, and these countries were aggressive in extending their empire over, and so there was constant war between these countries. And unfortunately for Israel, unfortunately for the Jews, to the east of their country was a desert, and no army could cross that desert. And so the armies from Babylon in the far east, they would have to travel up along the Euphrates River and round and down the coast of the Mediterranean, called the Way of the Sea. And this was a coastal road down from the north leading to Egypt in the south. And this was the only way really for an army to come. And therefore, when the Egyptians would attack either the Phoenicians or the Assyrians, they had to pass through the land of Israel along the way of the sea. And that meant there was constant war and constant invasion. So let us take a break now, and after the break we will see how this has influenced the Bible which we read today. Welcome back to the Word of God. As we've seen in previous talks, in the year 721, the northern kingdom, with its center in Samaria, was wiped off the map, wiped out of history by the Assyrian Empire. The 10 tribes were lost, and they disappeared because they were many deported to foreign countries, and foreign people with foreign religions were sent into and settled in the northern kingdom. The northern kingdom is where Galilee is. If you remember from the Gospel, Galilee of the Gentiles, it's called, because in the course of history, after the year 721, many Gentile people, pagan people, were settled in the northern kingdom by the Assyrians. And they remained pagans, and some mixed and intermarried with the Israelites, but that corrupted their religion. And the southern kingdom was destroyed by the Babylonians in the year 587. That's when Jerusalem was totally destroyed, bloodshed, and with great cruelty, and many thousands taken into captivity in Babylon, and everything destroyed. There has never been a king of the line of David sitting on the throne since the year 587. That was the last. And the temple sacrifices were finished then too. And they were strangers and captives in Babylon, surrounded by mighty nation and a mighty religion too. Great temples and great pagan services, worship. And the Jews were born there and growing up there. New generation surrounded by these pagans, and they were intermingling with the pagans, and they were settling down there and making a living there and being influenced by the culture of the Babylonians, so much so that they adopted the language of the Babylonians. They forgot in the course of time their own Hebrew language, and they spoke the language of Babylon, the Aramaic. And they also adopted the legal system of the Babylonians and so many other cultural things of Babylon, because Babylon was an advanced race. This is the time when the Bible takes its final form. And this is when the Bible becomes so important for the people. When they were in Jerusalem, they had prophets preaching to them. Jeremiah, Isaiah, and the disciples of Isaiah, and Amos and Hosea, and all the prophets. They preached to the people. The religion was a living religion. And there was a temple in Jerusalem, and everyone had to go to the temple at least once a year, and they participate in the sacrifices and in the feasts of the Jewish religion. And there was a priesthood, and the father handed on all the instructions to his son. There was no need for the written rules about how to worship, how to do sacrifice, how to perform the rituals in the temple. There were no need to have the rules written down, because it was a living religion, and one generation taught the next and handed it on in a living way. But now all that had gone. There was nothing anymore. They were in a far-off country, and a totally different culture, and the people there, well-to-do. It was an advanced country for the time. You might call a superpower of the time. But they were pagans. And the younger generation was absorbing this. And the Jews had to preserve their identity. And so that is when we get the Bible in its final form, so scholars tell us. And don't look for historical facts. Look for, because the people writing it, they are not writing an unbiased account. They are very biased. They are wanting to persuade their people that their religion is the greatest, that we are the chosen people of God. And so you get the stories of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. And the stories about them are to show how God has chosen them and made promises to them, and whatever happened to the patriarchs, God was faithful to his promises, and he looked after and cared for his people. So the stories of the patriarchs show how God fulfills his promises against all odds. The patriarchs, they see the promised land, although they don't own it, except for the burial ground that Abraham bought for his wife. But God has promised to give them this promised land, Canaan, the Holy Land, because it belongs to God. And despite their slavery in Egypt, God keeps his promises and brings them to the promised land. And the Bible, and even though that they are now in exile, they have lost the promised land, yet God is going to bring them back to the promised land from exile. So this is the stories of the Bible are going to impress this upon the generation of Jews now in exile, and who have lost everything and are despondent and are giving up the faith in Yahweh, because Yahweh has not shown his power. And the gods, as they thought in those days, the gods of Babylon were greater and stronger than the God of the Israelites. And so so this is the purpose why they're going to write the Bible now. The Bible goes from the time of Abraham through the exile, and then at the after 50 years in exile, then the Babylonian Empire is overthrown by the Persians. And Persian leader, king, is Cyrus. And Cyrus marches into Babylon. By this time, the Babylonian Empire was totally corrupt. In the history of the human race, apart from the sudden fall of the Soviet Union in the end of the 20th century, when the Soviet Union collapsed like a pack of cards, the Babylonian Empire also collapsed like that. It had been a mighty empire, but it was corrupt, and it collapsed. And Cyrus walked into Babylon without firing an arrow, you might say. The people welcomed him, welcomed the Persian army, because the Babylonian Empire had internally collapsed. And Cyrus, this was in 538, he decreed that those who had been deported to Babylon by the previous emperors were now free to go back to their countries, and they could have their own religion, and they could live more or less according to their own culture, but they would have to pay the tribute to the emperor. And so they returned in the year after the year 538. Then the Jews began to return back to the Holy Land. Faced with this situation, those who were deeply concerned about the religion of Israel, about the covenant made by Yahweh at Sinai, have given us the Bible as we know it today. God bless you and keep you.